T Visas, Immigration Options for Survivors of Labor Abuses or Sex Abuse, by Helen Tarokic Law, PLLC, Wilmington, North Carolina, www.tarokiclaw.com. Call us at 910-509-7145. This video is property of Helen Tarokic Law. The video may not be downloaded or posted anywhere except by HT Law or with written permission of Helen Tarokic Law. This video is intended to be viewed for general informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice for a particular situation. Please consult an attorney to learn more about your immigration options. The intended viewers of this presentation are current clients of Helen Tarokic Law, potential or future clients, or others wanting to learn more about T visas.
Hello, my name is Tayeba Qureshi. I work with Helen Tarokic Law in Wilmington, North Carolina as an associate attorney. We assist our clients with a variety of immigration matters across the United States. And this is part 2 of our T visa video series. And this is being recorded in the summer of 2024. I'd like to introduce our managing attorney, Helen Tarokic. Helen?
Hi, I'm Helen Tarokic. I'm a North Carolina board certified immigration law specialist and very excited to be here today to talk about T visas again.
Yes, and so if you have not seen our part 1 video, it is available on our social media and on our website hopefully soon, but we can also send it to you by email, so please do watch that first. It will help the rest of this make sense. We really want you to watch the whole series and hope that it'll help you learn more about T visas. So we'll start off with more of a focus in this video on what trafficking looks like and what labor trafficking and commercial sex trafficking is. We're going to talk more about the elements of those offenses and what that means for how we put a T visa case together. We'll start with T visas for victims of labor trafficking. And before we get started, Helen, I do want to point out that it's not really the job of the person applying for a T visa to figure out, I'm a victim of labor trafficking, I'm a victim of sex trafficking. And this is something that comes out through conversation with the screening team, with the attorneys, and it's a legal decision that we make once we see all the facts about the case. And so this is just kind of explanatory for the people who are watching it, but we don't need them coming into the firm, talking to our team, trying to already know what happened to them and figure that out from a legal perspective. All right, so what is this interesting diagram, Helen? So this is something that we use to help us describe both in the T visa application, but also when we're talking about it generally, what labor trafficking is. So Helen, can you talk us through this a little bit?
Sure. So the federal definition of labor trafficking is similar to what you'll see in most states as well. And it's a really long definition with a lot of complicated parts. And so this is just a breakdown. We've seen this chart come up in lots of different versions from many different angles. But basically, we're trying to figure out why a person was made to do something. Sometimes it is services like working really long hours in a restaurant. Sometimes it's a non-economic type of thing that they're being made to do, and that would be something like serving someone personally as opposed to in the workplace, let's say. And how do we figure out what they're being made to do or why? This chart will help us understand. So the first step we're looking at in terms of the analysis, whether somebody might have been recruited into a job or recruited to come to the United States for some reason. Sometimes that's just a person went and applied for a job and the person then offering the job already had in mind that they would exploit this person in the workforce. Harboring can be physical harboring or it can be psychological harboring. So sometimes it is manipulation, mind games that are making people do things that the traffickers want them to do. And sometimes it really is like holding people physically in a location and not allowing them to move. For labor trafficking, you don't have to have recruitment and harboring. You might have one or the other, or you could have movement or obtaining, and there's a few other things we might see there as well. So we're looking to check one of those items in that box. Then we're also looking to see whether there was force or fraud or coercion. It doesn't have to be all three again, but force generally we think of as like physical force, like grabbing someone's arm and making them paint part of a wall, or fraud, false promises to pay, tricking someone, false promises to sponsor them for a visa, things like that. And then coercion is really a catch-all category, I think, because it can be things like threats to deport. It can be things like abusing the legal system, threatening to file bankruptcy instead of paying someone their lawfully earned wages. Coercion can also be things like faith-based coercion, like threatening eternal damnation in the religious context. So lots of different things that can be coercion. We'll talk more about that later. And then the goal of traffickers is to get either involuntary servitude, like some kind of service that the person would not have done if they hadn't been forced or tricked or coerced. Or it may be for them to take on a real or imagined debt. And sometimes the way that that debt is paid off is not at a normal rate. So someone might be paying someone $1 an hour and they might owe $1,000. Well, it's going to take 1,000 hours to work off that debt. And that's not within our wage and hour rules and not within a normal way to pay things off. So that's where debt bondage and peonage come from. Slavery typically means obtaining or purchasing a person and having them work without any pay at all. But there are other permutations of that. And then finally, commercial sex, often very misunderstood in the trafficking sphere. But commercial sex can be things like forced prostitution in colloquial terms, or commercial sex can be things like offering someone something of value, like their life, not to kill them in exchange for sex. That might be something like a coyote or smuggler or agent threatening someone that they won't be able to leave the stash house where they're being kept, or that they'll be physically harmed if they don't participate in sex. And because they're offering something of value there, like their life, or sometimes it's onward movement in the journey, or safety, sometimes it is money or drugs or alcohol. All of those things can fall under commercial sex.
Mhm. That's a fantastic explanation. Thank you, Helen. And I just want to kind of summarize a little and say that what we are thinking about as attorneys is trying to identify the bad action that happened to that victim or the survivor. So that's kind of what you see in the process section. What happened? And then the means is, why did it happen? Right? Or how did it happen? How did it happen? How did that person end up? How did that victim or survivor end up in this situation? And then the end is, why did it happen? What was the reason that this whole process took place and put this victim or survivor into a difficult situation? So process means end. Thank you so much. And so we'll go on now to a little bit more talking about coercion. So coercion, as we said in the means section, is how somebody is getting that victim or that survivor to do this thing that they don't want to do, right? So force, fraud, or coercion. We don't need all three, we need one. And a lot of times they overlap. Many different techniques are used to keep somebody under control as a victim of labor trafficking. So you explain that force is kind of actually grabbing the person and making them do something by maybe restraining them or using violence or not allowing them to leave some particular housing or work area. So it's taking some physical action that hurts them or restricts their freedom in some way. And fraud is kind of generally what people think about when they hear about fraud, being tricked, right? Using tricks or lies or false promises that result in that victim agreeing to do something that they might not otherwise have wanted to do or agreed to do if they knew the full truth of the situation. So Helen, can you talk a little bit more about coercion? What is coercion in the trafficking context?
Sure. So sometimes it may be some type of physical harm that's threatened if somebody doesn't work long hours without the correct pay, or they're threatening physical harm against a person if they complain about the workplace conditions in a restaurant. Or in the domestic violence or intimate partner context, it's often physical beatings and domestic violence, which is the physical coercion that is used, a threat of harm to get somebody to do the cooking and the cleaning and just excessive chores within the household, sometimes working outside of the household as well. And it ends up being coercion, and it's actually labor trafficking taking place in the domestic or intimate partner violence context. Now, serious harm does not have to be physical, and the definition under the law is very clear about that. It says it can be non-physical. This can be psychological harm, financial harm, or reputational harm. So just a few quick examples. If somebody in the workplace is complaining about not being paid on time or being paid correctly or being made to work in unsafe conditions or being made to put up with sexual harassment, right? In those situations, then they complain and they get fired for that. That's an unlawful retaliatory firing for someone asserting their lawful labor rights in this country, whether they're work authorized or not, right? Because that type of wage and hour or other treatment would be inappropriate. Well, the people then around them who've seen that firing happen know that if you assert your rights in the workplace, that you're then going to suffer this reputational harm. Being fired is a terrible thing. Maybe you won't be able to get a workplace reference. Maybe you won't be able to get a job somewhere without the ex-employer, the trafficker, then saying that this person was lazy or was making up things and basically hurting their reputation. So the psychological fear of that reputational harm is coercion for the purpose of labor trafficking. Similarly, with financial harm, threats to bankrupt somebody, threats to make somebody homeless, threats to make it so that they're not going to be able to pay their rent, threats to cancel their visa sponsorship so that they'd suffer severe financial harm after years of investing in their immigration case. Things like that can also be serious harm for coercion. They're going to make people do more things, often with psychological coercion, than they are with physical. Because physical, at some point, the broken bones or the bruises help someone realize this is so outside of the acceptable things that can take place in the workplace or in the home, that maybe at some point they'll say, this is so obvious to me, I've got to get out. Psychological coercion, we often hear survivors or victims say that it was even worse because they could never really tell for sure, were they crazy or was this somebody who was doing something truly horrible to them? So we look at both of those things. Abuse of the legal process is also clearly within the definition of coercion. The number one thing most law enforcement or other agencies will realize is that threats to deport someone is an abuse of the legal process, because the deportation or removal system is not designed to get people to be sex slaves or to put up with sexual harassment or to suffer wage and hour violations. The deportation or removal process is a civil proceeding meant only to focus on removing people from the United States who don't have lawful status. So when you threaten deportation, it's abusing that legal process and making it like you can control things in ways with the government that you really shouldn't do, and that the law was not designed to do. So basically, immigration doesn't want to be a tool in traffickers' processes by allowing people to make threats of deportation. But other abuses of legal process are often things like, so sue me. You're not going to get anywhere in court if you try to get these back wages paid because I'm an American and you're not. And if you try to sue me, I'll make sure that, you and your whole family suffers and you'll be the one who goes to jail. Or I'll file for bankruptcy and you'll never get a dime out of this. Like, those kinds of threats are not what the bankruptcy system or civil proceedings are really designed to do. They're there to just determine liability, who owes a debt and who needs to pay it. So when people use threats like that, it falls under coercion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And from a perspective of from the survivor or victim, right? This is what we mean when we say, I felt like I couldn't say no. I felt like I couldn't complain, right?
Yeah.
So the things that we want to hear from survivors and victims are, what were the things that were going on around you that made you feel like you couldn't say no, right? Was it something someone said, something someone did, a feeling they made you have? Something that you saw that made you feel afraid, some worry that you had, some pressure that you had, that made you feel like you had to just go with what was happening. And so that is kind of in kind of non-lawyer speak, real people terms, right? Coercion is, it made me feel like I couldn't say no. It made me feel like I had to do what this person wanted me to do.
And people will even make excuses saying, I was here, recently arrived. I had no idea what the laws were, and almost blame themselves. But victims are not supposed to have to know every single law out there. This really comes down to objectively, did the person who was causing the harm use these techniques to get people to do things? And that's where a lot of predatory tactics or a lot of abuse will take place, because traffickers know that immigrants, often undocumented ones, aren't going to know all of the rules and customs and wage and hour laws and protective rights that people have in this country. And so they're going to take advantage of that, using coercion to get people to go through, again, usually a workplace exploitation situation, or it can be household or on a farm, on a ranch, or in other contexts as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about commercial sex trafficking. And again, these definitions and these fancy terms that we're using for labor trafficking and sex trafficking, these can often mix together. Labor trafficking and sex trafficking can happen at the same time at work or at home. And so these are things that we'll talk about to define what it means from a legal perspective, and also what it might look like for the victim or survivor. So I want to first say that we're going to start this conversation by talking about commercial sex trafficking for adults. There's a different standard for minors. So we're talking generally about it, but also about adults. And so, Helen, can you explain to us what is the definition of commercial sex trafficking?
So for adults, sex trafficking is going to be a situation where someone was recruited or harbored, maybe kept in a place, or psychologically harbored, meaning made to feel that they couldn't leave a situation. Maybe they're transported. They could be transported to the United States, or it just might be somewhere within the United States as well, like to and from a stash house in Texas, say. It could be a situation where someone's being provided to another person or being obtained. And there's situations where a person is being patronized or solicited. So the way that this is all happening, there's lots of different ways for it to happen. But the goal in each commercial sex trafficking act is to get commercial sex, which is a sexual act where something of value, anything of value, is given or offered or received by any person. So it's a very broad definition. I think even as immigration attorneys, in the beginning, when we were all learning about the T visa rules and how they would apply, most immigration attorneys thought, well, I don't deal with commercial sex. I've never represented someone who worked in prostitution, and therefore this could not have happened to my clients. The more we learn about commercial sex trafficking, the more we learn about how many of our clients have been victims of commercial sex trafficking. They might have just not realized at the time that this is what it was defined as. So they might have thought that they were a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, or they might have thought that they were a victim of pedophilia. But in the end, it may fall under those categories, but also under trafficking. For adults, this sex act needed to be induced by force or fraud or coercion. So physical force, taking sex by physical force, fraud, which would be being tricked into essentially being made to have sex. Some of this can relate to also being drugged or roofied and then being made to have sex. Or coercion. Again, this could be psychological manipulation or threats to deport. There were even some cases where in the past people were being threatened with deportation if they didn't participate in sex, and those were commercial sex ring crimes. The thing of value does not have to be money. Again, often it is. I'm going to offer you money in exchange for sex that you do not want to consent to, and I'm going to threaten you or your family to get it. That would be commercial sex trafficking. Notice that that doesn't have to involve more than two people. It could be a one-on-one situation and still fall under commercial sex. And it doesn't have to be that the person has ever done anything to do with prostitution. The thing of value can be life, safety, money, food, phone call, part of an onward journey. We find with, just the way the world is today, that a lot of things like vape pens, cannabis, alcohol, cigarettes, things like that are also considered things of value that will be used instead of money to offer somebody. And I also would just like to mention that conspiracy or attempt also counts. So in the commercial sex world, we'll also call this grooming, right? Someone's doing something inappropriate like sexual harassment in the workplace. Their ultimate goal might be to coerce someone into having sex, but it may never quite get to that. Hopefully the person will get help and get out of the situation before it gets to that time. But the grooming, the planning, the unwanted comments, the constant insistence, maybe connecting it to a paycheck or connecting it to promotion or being fired, all of that can fall under commercial sex trafficking as well.
Mm-hmm. And I heard you say when you were defining a thing of value that it is something valuable that is given or received by any person. So for example, it doesn't have to be that the person who was made to have sex, the victim and survivor, that the thing is given to that person. It could be, for example, if you have sex with me, I will give diapers to your children, or I will not hurt your mother, or something like that. It can be a person who is apart from the victim or survivor who receives that thing from the trafficker.
Exactly. And in the context of commercial sex work, you would see that with a pimp who is getting money from Johns to have sex with someone. I'm sorry, the pimp is getting money from Johns who are going to have sex with someone that the pimp controls or is coercing in that situation. We'll see this in the immigration context a lot of times with things like, well, you're stuck here in the household and I'm not going to let you leave. And but I am going to send money home to Honduras or to Guatemala for your kids. And that's the only thing that is going to happen financially. You're not going to get, nice clothes or makeup or anything else here, but I'm going to make sure that at least your kids out of the country are being taken care of. And then they're using usually psychological manipulation or physical force or both to keep that person in the sexual relationship in the United States. And so the thing of value would be this money being sent home. But we would also look at that situation as someone who's being harbored. And so they're also providing maybe food and shelter, even if it's not money. And those could be things of value as well. So there is a lot of crossover there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. All right. So let's talk about a thing of value. And every time we talk about this case, Helen, we always have to roll our eyes a little bit because one of the primary things about this case is the AAO, Administrative Office of the Courts, decided in 2021, congratulations, Helen, that a woman's life is a thing of value. So officially, now that they said it, it's true. So let's talk about the concept of a thing of value not being just money exchange, right? It can also be safety. It can be, like you said, the next piece of the journey. It can be food. It can be medicine given to not just the survivor or the victim, but someone else, right? We've even seen situations like, a person on a trafficking journey being made to have sex so that other people won't be harmed, right? That person kind of having to carry the load, the moral load of that. So please talk a little bit about what this case is and how a thing of value is not just financial.
Yeah, so there was a T visa case. Of course, we don't share our client details. All of the work that we do is confidential. But without sharing client names, the Administrative Office of Appeals will issue written decisions when they overturn a T visa denial. And so the one that we're referencing here is one of those. Under the Trump administration, we received some terrible decisions in T visa cases that we had to appeal. And one of them was saying that basically this was just rape, which is a terrible thing to say in any context. But essentially, they were saying that if this person had received money and then was threatened to be thrown into the river or killed, then maybe it would have been a commercial sex act. But this physical threat to hurt her or others wouldn't be enough to make it a commercial sex act. So that was overturned on appeal. And again, I'm sorry to get, into such legal conversations over this, but I think it's really important to say that a person's life, and in this case, a woman's life, is a thing of value. So when you threaten to take away that life by killing a person in order to make them have sex, that is essentially, if you look at it the other way around, offering their life, a thing of value, in exchange for sex they don't want to have. And that's what commercializes that act and makes it commercial sex act. Commercial sex is work. That's why they call it commercial sex work. So there's also a servitude part of that as well, where someone's being forced to provide sexual services. We've seen that sometimes the government gets very confused about sexual servitude, and they just want to see this thing of value, money or someone's life in exchange for sex that the person can't consent to or doesn't want to consent to. So this case was a really important one. The appeal came through. We're very happy to see that result, and we've seen this in other cases as well. And I think now the T Visa policy manual that came out in 2021 and subsequent final regulations make it much clearer for immigration officers to do a better job adjudicating or making decisions in this type of T Visa case. But I think it's just so important for us to recognize that attacks by smugglers or other people in the United States against immigrants or threats to do so are huge flags for trafficking, which might mean then a T visa opportunity is there for a person to get humanitarian relief based on the victimization they experienced.
Thank you. So let's talk about minor victims under 18 of commercial sex trafficking. The biggest issue here is the ability to consent, right? So a minor by nature, a person under 18, cannot consent to a sexual act for the purposes of immigration law. And so the minor victim does not have to show that there was force, fraud, or coercion in trying to apply for a commercial sex act based T visa. So Helen, can you explain a little more about this?
Sure. One of the things I wanted to mention was that the definition of minor changes throughout immigration law. There are times when immigration will consider someone to be under 25, under 21, under 18, under 16, under 14 for different types of rules. So if somebody's young and you're not sure which rule applies to them, again, an attorney is the one to step in and say which rule will apply. For T visas, they're using the rule under 18, which means that a foreign country or a different state in the US might have different age limits as well. But for T visa purposes, we're looking at anyone under 18 and saying, first of all, they can't consent to sex. So if you're going to provide a minor with alcohol and try to groom them to have sex, you're providing something of value, and they're too young, if they're under 18, to consent to that sex. So even if they act like they want the alcohol and they act like they want the sex, the law says they can't. And therefore, this is commercial sex trafficking in these cases. I think that people, again, have a lot of self-blame, or they think about what was going on in their mind at the time when they were 15 or 16 or 17. But again, they can't consent under this federal statute. So regardless of what they thought they were thinking at the time, the law still protects them. So really, we're just looking for something of value that may have been provided: a vape pen, a cigarette, rides home, a car. We've seen a lot of things with social media, folks wanting to meet up on social media, and the person is much older than the person under 18, and they're offering to meet at a restaurant and have dinner. And it could be a situation where they may be trying to kidnap that person and then have sex with them, or they're asking them to send pictures that are inappropriate over the internet. And that can all fall under this very broad protective rule.
Mm-hmm. And another thing to remember, especially just generally about T visas, but especially in this context, is a person doesn't have to apply for a T visa while they are still being victimized, right? So it's
Right.
something that could have happened in the past, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, something that happened to them in the past that they have escaped from that situation. They're not currently being trafficked, but it's part of their history, right? So this person who was under 18 when they were victimized by commercial sex trafficking, that is still important. That's something relevant. Their age at that time is relevant, even if they are an adult now.
Such a great point. Thank you so much.
Of course. All right, so this is the similar kind of diagram of what we saw earlier, but here the force, fraud, or coercion is missing because for a minor, we don't have to show that. So we just show that it happened and that there was a thing of value exchanged.
And there
All
often
right.
is force, fraud, or coercion, but we don't have to show it. But it is a much simpler chart, makes it a much simpler standard as well. And so I think that that's helpful when we're looking at these cases because people often are thinking about, well, this is an adult, so we have to go back and, prove all of this extra stuff. But if they were under 18 at the time, we don't.
Mhm. Okay, so let's summarize a little bit, and then we'll move into some examples of what trafficking can look like in different situations. So what's really important to understand for people watching this video is that trafficking can take many different forms. And what we're going to talk about are just a few examples. And it's really important for someone who's considering, any kind of immigration remedy to be completely honest and forthright with the attorney and their team so that we can hear everything from you that happened to you so that we can then determine what your eligibility might be. The other thing to remember is that more than one kind of trafficking can happen to the same person. A person can be the victim of labor trafficking and commercial sex trafficking interspersed at work and at home. And so it's important to kind of tell the entire situation so that we can figure that out. And of course, attorneys love to give disclaimers, right? This video and any of the other videos that you hear from us or anything that you see on our website is just an overview. And if there is something that a person wants to know about for their life and their options, they really should speak with a qualified immigration attorney, a licensed attorney, not someone a friend or a community member who says that they can help you fill out immigration forms and learn more about their specific options. All right, Helen, pop quiz. I'm going to ask you the questions.
Okay.
Let's see if you're.
I've studied for this test.
You studied for this test, right? So I know Helen is a North Carolina board certified immigration law expert. She's had to take many hours of trainings and a big test to get ready, but this one's going to be harder than that. So are you ready?
Yes.
All right. So, Helen, true or false? There are many paths to a T visa.
That is true. There are many paths to a T visa. Oh, and I have to qualify. I'm a specialist. I have dealt with expert requests before, but I'm a specialist under the North Carolina Board
Thank you.
Certified. I'm sorry, I've got to qualify that.
Thank you so much.
But,
North Carolina Board Certified Immigration Law Specialist.
You've got it.
There we go.
It's a long name.
A lot of words. Yeah. All right. So this one comes from our T Visa Part 1 video, but we can just do a little quick refresher. True or false? A T visa requires law enforcement certification on Form I-914B.
False. So unlike with U visas where you need law enforcement to sign off to file a U visa, with T visas, we might ask law enforcement to sign off or at least try to report what happened to the person, but we do not actually need them to sign the law enforcement certification form. However, if you're law enforcement and watching this, please know that when you do certify those forms, it can help. It documents an important part of a person's victimization. It may not be the determining factor in a case like this, but it is additional evidence. Every now and then we'll see that immigration will process these cases more quickly if they have law enforcement certification. Is that necessarily fair? No, but at the same time, I think that it is something where law enforcement can participate and be helpful when they do participate in a robust T visa certification program. And anything that law enforcement can do to help take trafficking reports, sign T visa certifications, create event reports, educate their officers or their police department, and communicate with the community about these options, the better. It will help prevent crime. And it will also help prevent crimes that are ongoing from continuing, and it will help heal our community and help their immigration status move forward faster whenever you have law enforcement that is well attuned and understanding about how trafficking works under the very broad definition that the federal government has, along with the often very broad definitions that state and local law provide for.
Absolutely. And to clarify, the certification is not required. It's helpful,
Correct.
but it's not required. But reporting is required. Reporting is a required part of the T visa, and that is something that we do as part of the application process.
And a lot of people are afraid to report. I will say there are some exceptions. There's a trauma exception, rarely used, but if it's too traumatic to move forward to communicate with law enforcement, there may be a trauma exception. Usually our law office doesn't have to rely on that though, because we do have other options we can offer clients to move forward with their cases. Also, in terms of reporting, with some minors in certain situations, reporting may not be required, but there are other benefits to reporting where ultimately we probably will move forward with reporting anyway. At the same time, and there's more on reporting we can talk about another time and have in the past as well. Please don't panic if you're hearing about reporting. Please don't panic if you're hearing about us talk about law enforcement. We've often found that reporting what has happened is something that ends up being an administrative report, especially for things that took place a long time ago where people aren't actively being currently harmed. A lot of times what we're doing is just trying to tell a law enforcement agency, like the Department of Labor, for example, that this labor exploitation took place so that it's documented, so that it's on the books, and then we can move forward with filing a confidential T visa application. But again, you don't have to have law enforcement certification. When it comes to reporting, there are some exceptions. Most of the time, the reporting is done very calmly by our law office. Of course, if someone is in an emergency situation or an imminent danger, they need to call 911 and not wait to talk to an attorney because, again, if you're in danger, 911 is the emergency number to call in the U.S.
Thank you. All right, next question. True or false? To file a T visa, to be eligible for a T visa, the victim has to have been brought into the U.S. by their trafficker. True or false?
False. It's so helpful to have that answer also written in front of me. It's so important to know. Yes, there is a question on the T visa application form, or as it is, in the summer of 2024, that asks about if the person's entry was connected to the trafficking. And sometimes the answer to that question is yes, their traffickers smuggled them into the United States. And then after that, or along the way, continued to make them do things like cooking or cleaning or having sex using force or fraud or coercion. But many times, the trafficking has nothing to do with how the person came to this country. They might have come here on a visa. They could have come here in a hot air balloon. It doesn't matter how they actually physically entered the United States. If trafficking took place later on, even years later, then trafficking has taken place and they don't have to have been brought into the U.S. by the trafficker to apply for the T visa.
Thank you. All right, last one. You cannot file a T visa if the trafficking happened many years ago. True or false?
False. We see this all the time. People say, I was trafficked in 1997, or I was trafficked in 2021, or I was trafficked 15 years ago. And all of those things can make a difference for how we document the case, but there's not a specific time limit as to when the trafficking took place regarding can you still report it today? Yes, you can report something that happened 30 years ago today and still file for a T visa.
All right, so let's move on to what T visas actually look like. And of course, they can take many forms. And I think one of the biggest knowledge gaps we see, Helen, about T visas is how broad the definition of trafficking and T visa eligibility actually is. Not just from survivors of trafficking, but even maybe from attorneys who are still learning how to file T visas and how the remedy works. And so that's one reason why you offer trainings for attorneys, therapists, social workers, law enforcement officials who want to learn more about the T visa remedy. So we're going to start in this next section of the video talking about some common fact patterns that can result in T visa eligibility. And just a caution for people listening that this is just general advice based on our experience working with victims of trafficking, and we've been able to see some common fact patterns, but you should not take this as specific advice in your case. But if any of this sounds familiar, then you may want to book an immigration law attorney consult to see what your options might be. So,
Right.
Helen, let's
Just to
talk
clarify there,
first.
general information. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
It's okay.
General information, not general advice or
General
specific
information.
advice. We're just
Thank
providing
you.
an overview. I know it's hard. We're so
Yeah,
used to giving advice one-on-one. It's hard to say the word information.
true. That's true. So let's first talk about how T visas can arise within another visa status, within another immigration status, where someone's here on one of these examples that we see here.
So the K-1 visa is typically a fiancé visa, meaning someone plans to marry a U.S. citizen. So they are petitioned for and then go to a consular interview in their home country and then get a visa and fly to the United States. Then they have 90 days to marry the U.S. citizen and file for permanent residency. So that's how things are supposed to work. But sometimes fraud and coercion or other things will take place in the K-1 process, like someone pretends to be engaged in order to get this fiancé visa. So now something bad has happened, right? There's been misrepresentation, so they could get in trouble if the government found out. Well, they get here, and then the US citizen takes advantage of that and says, I'm not going to marry you or file your next step in the process unless you have sex with me in unusual ways or things that are making you uncomfortable, or unless you cook and clean day and night, 18 hours a day, regardless of your health level. Or they'll have them do other types of services like uh, cooking the books, doing fraudulent paperwork, working at their business without pay, things like that. So normally in the K-1 fiancé process, what's supposed to happen is, again, there's a real engagement. It's not for an immigration benefit, but the visa is issued for them to come here, marry, and apply for permanent residency based on a marriage that's planned to allow people to spend the rest of their lives together. That's what's supposed to happen. But when there's abuse, fraud, or coercion that's taking place in this fiancé relationship, that may be a reason to then file for a confidential T visa instead of being beholden to the sponsor and instead of accepting those threats from the sponsor. Often the threat is, I'm going to get you in trouble with the law if you don't do these things. But the T visa turns things on its head and says, you know what, if you're going to threaten me and take advantage of me, now that I know that none of this should have happened in the first place, I have an option to report. I have an option to confidentially apply and get my T visa status and hopefully eventually a green card as well, without having to go through labor, involuntary servitude, labor exploitation, or commercial sex.
And
Sorry.
I will just point out before you move on to the next one that this slide is important because it explains to people that it's not just that you can only apply for a T visa if you're here undocumented, across the border with no papers, and that's the only kind of person who applies for a T visa. I mean, that is one possibility. Sometimes people who come here crossing the border are able to apply for T visas, but these things trafficking can also arise in other status.
Absolutely. And in my original training, I've been an attorney for a really long time now. In my original training, the training was really focused on if somebody is a K-1 overstay and they never completed their marriage, then there's really very little or nothing that you can do for them. That was just like where the K-1 law ended. But had I been trained originally to also understand that for more than 20 years, there's a T visa law that protects people, I would say every time a case came across my desk when someone was out of status in whatever visa they were on, did something go sideways? Because most people who come on a visa really are not trying to do anything wrong. Things really have to go sideways. Usually there's some bad actor, and then the person falls out of status. Or things were never quite done right in the first place, and then this, fraud or coercion took place and a person was victimized. Or maybe they came in on a K-1 visa for whatever reason, everything was legitimate, but they never did get their green card through the K-1. And then later on, they were trafficked in a laundromat. Well, the T visa is an option for that person too. So again, the manner of entry might be with a valid visa, but it doesn't always get connected to the trafficking when we're filing for a T visa for the person who had that type of visa entry. I know this can get kind of complicated, but what I would just like to say is if someone is out of status, like meaning their visa has been violated somehow, if they've been told there's nothing that can be done, I would want to know, has that person been screened for a T visa? Because we're looking at every job they've ever had, why things went sideways with their visa overstayed to begin with. We're looking at religious communities and faith-based coercion. We're looking at domestic relationships. We're looking at sexual harassment. We're looking at sexual abuse, so many other things, right? All of these many paths to a T visa to say, okay, is there something for this person or not? So if someone just goes, oh, you're a visa overstayed, nothing I can do for you unless you're married to an American. Whoa, put on the brakes there and say, do you know anything about T visas? Have you screened me for that? And it may make that person think twice before they just close the door.
Absolutely. So there's a few different things on this slide that talk about a work visa. You're here working. So we don't necessarily need to go into the detail of what each kind of program this is. But can you talk about how T visas can arise when someone is here on a work visa, one of these other letters, one of this other alphabet soup?
Sure. I can go through these ones pretty quickly too. So the H-2A and H-2B programs, we're usually looking at seasonal or agricultural type of work programs. They're usually making people pay for stuff they shouldn't have to pay for to get the visa in the first place, or they're violating the contract, not paying them correct wages, or they're in some type of horrific housing or unsafe conditions. So these seasonal agricultural H-2 violations are very well known by the government. The H-2 violators, those traffickers are well understood for what their schemes already are. There's been so many prosecutions, so immigration is usually pretty understanding at granting those T visas. The A, G, and B categories are usually connected to some type of temporary visa to be in the United States. A and G is usually about working for some type of diplomat or diplomat adjacent kind of situation, and they're being treated not just like a domestic servant, but they're being abused in some way. And there have been horrific stories of people who have been mistreated by diplomats, unfortunately. And the Department of State Diplomatic Security Service has been amazing in crime prevention and dealing with visa crimes by diplomats, including working on things related to preventing them from being able to get security clearances for visas down the road later on. So if somebody is in that situation, there's definitely help. Also, the B visa category is there because some B1, B2 visitors are coming to, say, be a household domestic servant for someone, and then there's the abuse that goes along with it, and so we end up doing a T there. With H-1B workers, often if you're an H-1B worker, you should have gotten a copy of your labor condition application generally. Oftentimes folks are yelled at, or there's false promises to sponsor, or they're being told their wages in one area, but being paid a different lower wage in another, and being screamed at or sexually harassed or being put on projects that aren't a part of their H-1B role. All of those are flags for a T visa. And then finally, with the E2 investment scams, these might be sweat equity cases. It's often involving some type of false promise where a person is not only investing money, but they're also investing like their time and physical labor. And then because of that scam, the false promises, the fraud, they've ended up becoming involuntary servants to who was supposed to be helping them with their investment or be a business partner or something like that.
You are doing great, Helen. Just keep on going.
There's a lot of them. Okay, J1 visas. And again, my background in business immigration, I love doing business immigration for many years. It was great to learn how to do work visas for people. And the J1 International Exchange Program is an incredible international cultural exchange program that has been life-changing for people to come to the US. They can come in the teacher category. They can come in the au pair, which is like a childcare category. They can come in the summer work travel program where you get to work part of the summer and guess what? Travel the other part of the summer. So the J1 program can be amazing. Where it goes sideways is where the T visa fits in. So it might be that the host family is not following the J1 rules and having someone who's an au pair work excessive hours, not paying them appropriately. There have been some cases with au pairs of sexual violence or sexual harassment in host families as well. So again, these are things that aren't supposed to happen. And it's not to criticize one particular program or one particular visa, but where things are distorted or used to exploit people, that's where the T visa comes in. With the S visa, that is also known as the snitch visa. It's about people who have information about serious crimes that have been committed. But sometimes there are threats or coercion that made them do things in the US or on the way to the US from the very beginning. And sometimes the people that they're cooperating for within law enforcement have also gone rogue and abused the legal process, promising an S visa in ways that they shouldn't. And so those rogue actors can be reported, and an S visa may end up not going through, but a T visa may go through and be more viable than the S. R1 visas are religious worker visas. So the scenarios we see that in are often labor trafficking, false promises to sponsor the person for an R1 religious worker visa or a green card, threatening excommunication from the church or other religious organization if they don't do excessive volunteering or unpaid work. Sometimes it's unreasonable tithing, meaning you have to donate like 50% of your earnings to this religious organization, or you may suffer eternal damnation, or we're going to cancel your work visa and you won't be able to be a part of the religious worker program anymore if you don't do these things that are really not a part of the visa process to begin with. So there could be things in any of these contexts that are sex trafficking or labor trafficking, and it also doesn't have to be necessarily in like a workplace as we think of one as a construction site or a laundromat. It may be something like in the J1 context happening in a home, or it could be something that happens in the streets. It may not be at a job location.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, so let's talk a little bit about kind of a day-to-day experience that someone who is a survivor or victim of trafficking might see in their workspace. And again, let's remember that labor and sex trafficking can happen at the same time, at the same place, in the same physical locations, in the same relationship. So we see a lot of patterns based on the kind of tracking different kinds of places where labor trafficking happens. So landscaping or construction, we might see some similar fact patterns there. Cleaning houses, cleaning workplaces, nail or hair salon, beautician work, cosmetology, anything to do in the restaurant where there are sharp knives and hot things all over the place can cause labor trafficking. Gas station, convenience store, hotel, motel work, home care, home health care, nannies, babysitters, domestic work, or kind of extra contract work. So you're hired to do one thing, but your boss or your client is asking you to do something else on the side. So some of the common themes we see in labor trafficking in all of these scenarios is getting no safety equipment or training. So for example, operating some complicated machine without being taught how to do it properly, just expected to know it, or having to clean using chemicals, but you don't get gloves and you don't get a face mask to protect you from inhaling fumes. Threats to blacklist or blackmail, like you'll never work again if you complain here, or if I fire you, or if you quit, I'll make sure that no one here in this town ever hires you again. So that's called blacklisting. Just any kind of mean, angry behavior, yelling, threatening, name calling, insulting, demeaning someone, saying mean things to them can also be part of a labor trafficking experience or a sex trafficking experience. Working long hours with no pay or low pay, one thing that we see often is, oh, this person doesn't get paid for training. They're not going to get paid for the first 2 weeks of work or 1 week of work because they're just being trained, right? Another might be not just that the owner or the manager of this workplace is doing all these bad things, but that the employee is expected to put up with it from customers or from colleagues or from, someone who's on premises to, fix the fridge or something, someone who's coming in to do something in the workplace, being harassing or being mean to this person. And then, of course, sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape, these things happen at work as well. And so any of these things can create eligibility for a T visa.
As I just look at this list and how you've described things, I can think of how many people have said, but that's just how the job is.
Right.
Like if this is trafficking, then everybody's been trafficked. And I say it's not that everybody's been trafficked, but it is that unfortunately what we see is that immigrants are often in industries that have high labor or sexual exploitation stats anyway, and that there's a lot of opportunity. So in the construction industry, someone being treated like they're an independent contractor, but they're working 70 hours a week. They don't have any other employer. The boss man is screaming at them and brings a gun onto the premises. That's controlling them so much. There's no way that would be classified, in my opinion, as an independent contractor. That is really someone being falsely classified as a contractor and instead being labor trafficked by an abusive general contractor. So in the gas station or convenience store context, I think that's another important one too, where someone might be a cashier, but they also might be offered promises of business ownership or partnership or a silent partnership at some point. And then we have this sort of false promise thing going on, but also they're not provided with other backup employees. So they're working 18, 19, 20-hour days, hardly any sleep at all, or even sleeping in the back of the store for short stints. And then they're basically not allowed to leave. They don't have childcare. Their kids might be stuck working in the gas station or convenience store as well after school because, again, there's no one to take care of the kids. Those are common labor trafficking cases that we have applied for T visas for and been successful throughout the years.
Absolutely. And one thing that I want to bring up here, you mentioned it, is there's a difference between someone being willing to work hard and do a good job and where that crosses over from kind of a personal work ethic into labor trafficking, right? When the demands of the job are just extreme, dangerous, long, abusive, that has crossed the line away from, I want to do a good job because I want to work hard and make a life for myself in the United States. And now it has become labor trafficking.
There's such an emotional connection to that too. I've heard that people will say, I'll hear people say things like, but in that job, the one where they were trafficked, I learned more there than I ever did anywhere else. Or that person was the first person to employ me in the US, so I owe them that. But my response to that is, if they were an appropriate employer, then they would have taught you everything that you know without screaming at you or violating wage and hour rules. And if they were the first person that you met, they would have also known that they had an obligation not to use force, fraud, or coercion to make you feel unfree to leave for years, or weeks, or or even days. So there's this situation where it's not all black and white, right? So if somebody's just horrible 24/7, it's a lot easier to say, I'm out of here. I can't take this. This is wrong. But where they give you your first job or they make you feel ingratiated or grateful to them for that first job, or say things like, "Oh, you're too old and undocumented. I'm going to give you a break and let you work here, even though I probably shouldn't because nobody else would want you," right? They make people feel like they now owe them something. Those are manipulative tactics where the trafficker looks like someone nice sometimes, but are also doing these horrible things. And that's really where that cycle, that manipulation continues on and on and on, and can really drag out trafficking victimizations for a long time.
That's right. And let's also talk now about what does a T visa look like at home or in a relationship. So we talked about workplace, like physically in somewhere where you would work. What does it look like at home or in a relationship? And another interesting thing, right, is that we have seen situations where a person works at a convenience store and then also lives at the home of the owner of the convenience store, right? And so they are being abused both at work and in the place where they live, which may or may not feel like home at that point, right? So let's talk about this. And one common thing that people don't know about T visas is that domestic violence can reach the level of trafficking visa eligibility of T visa. So we call it Cinderella T visas, kind of colloquially, right? So a person is being made to do everything in the home for someone they think is family, right? So cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, taking care of elders, just all day long, beyond what you would normally expect a family member to do. Cinderella servitude. Domestic labor inside the home, cooking, cleaning, taking care of children, taking care of elders, taking care of guests, taking care of family, taking care of people coming in and out of the house. And then a partner who makes the other partner work outside their home and then takes the income that they have earned, right? Sometimes that comes with comments like, well, you're the man of the house, so you should be earning and then giving me all the money, or vice versa, right? Maybe it's partner of either gender who's being made to work outside the home and then someone taking their income. Domestic violence, of course, rape and sexual assault and incest happening within a relationship that someone may even have willingly entered into in the beginning, but has now crossed beyond into trafficking. And so some themes that we see in situations like this are physical abuse, hitting, punching, slapping, throwing things at this person or throwing things at the wall behind them, right? So they're afraid that they might get hit. Emotional abuse, name calling, threatening, yelling at the person, calling them demeaning names, sexual abuse, forcing someone or making someone to have sex when they don't want to or in ways that they don't want to. Kind of this cultural or familial pressure of taking care of people because it's your job as a good husband or a good son-in-law or a good daughter-in-law or a good wife or a good anybody. And then threatening to make someone look bad, right? If you don't do this, what will people say? You're not going to fit in this community. People will look bad on you. People will look bad on this family. So in Urdu and Hindi, we call it badnami, right? Making someone look bad. And then another situation can be that this victim or survivor of trafficking has to not just work long hours at a workplace outside the home, but then also come home and cook and clean and do everything in the house as well. So then really their working hours are not just 9 to 5, but 6 a.m. till midnight, taking care of everything in addition to earning income for the home.
So then the question we have is, well, then is all marriage trafficking? If you're like, I look at this list and I'm like, I've been up since 5 o'clock in the morning. I did cooking, I did cleaning, I did childcare. I also came and worked at the office. So, I was doing all my mother duties, and I was also doing workplace duties. But what would make it trafficking, right? It would be that I was doing this because somebody hit me, or somebody threatened to hurt me or another family member, or wouldn't send money home that I had earned to a parent for an operation or something like that. So we can be here as immigrants or the children of immigrants and want to work hard or want to care for our family or want to have a good marriage. But on the other side, where there's forced fraud or coercion, that turns it into trafficking. Just like in the cartoon Cinderella, right? So for those of you who've seen the Disney version of Cinderella, she's got this evil stepmother and two evil stepsisters, And she's doing this, she's working and cleaning the fireplace, the cinders, that's where the Cinderella name comes from that they call her, doing all this work. But she doesn't in the movie really dislike her stepmom or her siblings. Instead, she's like surviving. She's singing to the birds and talking to mice and dancing around the house and just sort of like living her life oblivious in some ways to this manipulation and control that's going on. And so it's not something where people don't necessarily want to be part of a family, or want to do things in the home, like cooking a good meal. It comes down to, was there force, fraud, or coercion intended to make them do that involuntarily, or to convince them in some way that they had to do it, oftentimes using subtle manipulative tactics.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, this is something similar to what we talked about in the workplace scenario, right? Willing to work hard, not willing to be abused. Willing to be part of a relationship as a partner or a child or a daughter-in-law, son-in-law, but not willing to be abused, right? Willing to be willing to come into the United States, not willing to be trafficked and abused on the journey, right? And so that is where it crosses the line from a normal relationship, a normal situation, into possible trafficking visa. Okay, so let's talk about a few more fact patterns that people who practice T visa law see. So let's talk about abuse in religious communities, including brujeria, jadoo, witchcraft. What does it look like? What does religious trafficking look like?
So brujeria in Spanish is like a witchcraft, basically. There were some cases where people from Central America were told that a person had basically cast a spell in traditional, culturally known ways, and then that they owned these people's souls. And then they felt compelled to do all of this work and not leave the situation because they genuinely believed that something terrible would happen to them. They were petrified. And if something like that were to be threatened to me, I might not take it that way. But somebody who believes in this, we're looking at trafficking from the reasonable person in the shoes of the victim, what they would believe. So brujeria is used, and it's like, again, I'll hear this from attorneys over and over again. I've never had anybody with witchcraft or brujeria issue. And then I say, did you ever ask about it? Because nobody just walks into your law office and says, oh, by the way, does witchcraft count? So instead, once you start asking, then you start hearing lots of responses like, no, I never had a brujeria issue. And then you start also hearing, yes, I have had this problem. And then maybe also other things happen too, sometimes involving alcohol or drugs. And there's almost always a sexual element to it, but sometimes it is just labor. This other word, could you talk about this one?
Jadoo, yeah, sure. I'll back up a little and just generally talk about religious abuse, or abuse in religious communities in general. That, again, places of worship, religious communities, churches, mosques, temples. These things are places where people go to find community and feel comfort, and especially try to, resettle themselves and find stability after they've come from a different country, trying to establish a life here. And all of that is fine, and it's really a beautiful opportunity. Where it crosses the line is when some person or a group of people within that community is using that faith and that community feeling as a tool to manipulate somebody into doing something that they would not want to do, right? So clean my house, or I will tell everybody at our place of worship that you're a bad person, or if you don't, do what I want you to at work, then I will pray against you at our place of worship. Or I'll, jadoo, for example, very similar to what you explained in brujeria. Jadoo is the word that we use in Urdu and Hindi, where, same thing, witchcraft, putting spells on people, real or imagined, right, from the perspective of the person who is the victim of that. So again, just using what can be a beautiful community building experience to cause fear or cause someone to do something that they ordinarily would not want to do. All right, so let's talk about targeting of LGBTQIA plus individuals. Real or perceived here means that might be the way the person lives their life, or it might be a perception of the people around them and being discriminated against regardless. So please talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So I'll talk about this first in the smuggling turned trafficking context because I do feel like it comes up quite a lot. A person is chosen or targeted by the coyotes or smugglers or agents as someone that they think may be gay. And then they are made to perform sex. They may drug them, they may threaten them, but they basically keep them in a stash house or a bodega or some abandoned building for hours or days or weeks or even months. And they're essentially selling them to other people. They might be selling them to other immigrants coming through. It might be the coyotes or the smugglers who are just using this person and essentially harboring them, not allowing them to leave, and then giving them things of value like food occasionally during this time or alcohol or drugs, whether wanted or not. And so those terrible smuggling cases become trafficking cases because of this coerced sex. And the perception of the traffickers, their chosen target, may not have anything to do with whether this person identifies as gay or not, but they've for some reason chosen this person. And so then it may be an important element in the narrative that we have for our victim statement. Other times, it's very clear how a person identifies. Let's say someone came here as a child when they were 2 years old. Now they're 17 years old. They've been uh, unsure about their sexual orientation for a long time, but they now have met someone who's 20, who is seemingly a trustworthy person who is going to help them basically get out of the closet. But it's a 17-year-old and a 20-year-old. And so let's say they offer them alcohol or drugs for that first sexual experience. That is going to fall under commercial sex trafficking. And age limits here do matter. It may not have been intended in the way it resulted on either side. But if we're falling within the narrow definition or the broad definition of trafficking, either way, it's still going to be trafficking. Another context for LGBTQIA plus cases may be, say, in the workplace. It could be two adult relationships. And then now they're going to use LGBTQIA plus status to try to threaten or coerce or embarrass somebody into continuing to having sex with them or continuing to be in a relationship with them, otherwise basically threatening to out them to their peers. So these things could happen in so many other ways, right? They might just be threatening immigration status. It doesn't have to be an LGBT case. But I bring up these examples because I think that if people aren't aware of how it can result in targeting in the community, then they may miss out on an important legalization option. Another thing I just wanted to say about the LGBT community is that I've had cases where, yes, there was sex trafficking at some point, or they're currently in a violent, unsafe relationship that could be classified as trafficking. And they don't want to use any of that for their story. They want to focus their T visa case based on the work that they did in a restaurant where there were false promises to pay, late payments, getting pushed around in the kitchen or being made fun of, just what I would say a regular trafficking case that doesn't bring in sexual orientation or identification in any way. And we can do that. We don't have to bring in these incredibly personal, painful situations always. It gives people some freedom. Whereas in asylum cases, sometimes you don't have the freedom to choose which part of your story that you're going to tell. You can report specific incidents of trafficking. It may not be every single thing that has ever happened to you in your life that makes its way into the T statement, but we ask about all of these scenarios when we're screening people for T visas so that we can best advise people how strong their case is and what are their options for reporting or moving forward.
Thank you. And I will point out as well that, as you said, there are some cases where there might be dual eligibility. There are other facts that can create eligibility. Our applicants should also understand that this is a confidential process as relates to USCIS, right? They're not going to court for their T visa. This goes to a secure service center. It's done on paper. So it's not like a credible fear interview or an asylum hearing where they're going to be discussing what happened to them in public. But of course, as you stated, there are some circumstances where it might be possible to keep what they want confidential out of the application.
And of course, if someone is in immediate danger, again, we're talking about calling 911. If they're a harm to themselves or others, we're going to be discussing that as well about what we need to do to protect someone in that situation. I wouldn't want someone in an unsafe situation to just let that to continue. But I have seen in the past that sometimes we have to meet people where they are and say, okay, this is the situation we're going to help with first, and then let's get you some resources, some support, therapy, other types of assistance that might make then that person feel more comfortable moving forward with reporting other incidents or getting out of a situation that is complicated.
Absolutely. So we mentioned this a couple slides ago, smuggling turned trafficking. So this is actually recognized within the USCIS policy manual that adjudicators use to review and decide on T visa applications. It's a kind of trafficking where someone agrees to be brought into the United States, but then ends up being forced into labor or sex during the journey, forced or defrauded or coerced into labor or sex during the journey. And it was also clarified during recent revisions to the policy manual because previous presidential administration had been denying T visas based on smuggling turned trafficking to some degree. And then we were able to get that clarification in the policy manual. So can you talk a little bit about what is smuggling turned trafficking?
So the smuggling is really a crime across a border or a civil violation across a border or both. It's about bringing products in. You might smuggle in some type of medication that you're not supposed to have in the US, or you may smuggle in a person who's not supposed to cross into the United States that way, right? So smuggling is not about hurting a person, it's about crossing a border. Trafficking is about harming a person or threatening harm against the person. So again, involuntary servitude, debt bondage, peonage, commercial sex, slavery, that is all harming an individual. And usually force, fraud, or coercion is used to do that to a person. So in smuggling turned trafficking cases, there's often a lot of control. There's often a switch that flips. So we'll see promises made, like, I'm going to make your journey to the United States easy. It's going to cost $25,000. I'm going to make sure that you get in safe. Don't worry about it. You won't have to walk far. We've got a great network. And so it's all rosy starting out. But once they're away from home and they're traveling, now they don't know how to get away. They don't have resources or people in the community to go to. And so they're on this train that really can't stop, right? Now they're being transported. They're also being harbored. They're often isolated. There's often threats taking place. So they've really lost control of the situation. And the T visa policy manual made it clear that something that may have started out as smuggling can switch into trafficking in these cases. And so the forced labor or coerced labor or sex in these situations is going to be classified as trafficking. I think that that is something where it can be confusing to lots of people. I've definitely seen it where law enforcement is very confused as well. And there's even a comment within the new regulation and T Visa policy manual that some labor may be required to evade detection. And that might be something like running very quickly from one spot to another. That's like a physical movement, right? Or being told to hide under a tree or behind a bush or something like that. But if we're talking about cooking or cleaning, those are things that really the smuggling operation is responsible for. And once they start forcing people into free labor for it, it really has nothing to do with evading detection. It has something to do with them evading having a sufficient workforce in their illegal smuggling operation. So, there's multiple criminalities that are happening here. They may be bringing in drugs, they may be bringing in people, they may be also forcing people to work or to have sex. They can have two or three different ideas about how they want to victimize people. They may also be using extortion as well to gain additional money throughout this process of bringing people to the U.S. or getting them to their final destination.
Absolutely. Thank you. And just side note, it is important when someone is speaking to an attorney about their T visa eligibility to start from the beginning. Tell us how you came into the United States. We want to hear that part of the story as well. Okay, so let's talk about forced prostitution as a kind of commercial sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Please explain.
So this may happen when we see someone who has in the past been a drug abuser, had an addiction, who then couldn't afford the drugs anymore. And so then someone was a predator basically, and then gave them more drugs and said, okay, now you're going to have to work off this debt. But often the debt never really goes away. They keep them addicted to continue to coerce them into having commercial sex. And that's essentially commonly known as forced prostitution. So I wanted to just say then that the prostitution, that word in general, is often implying something voluntary, because there may be commercial sex without forced fraud or commercial or coercion with adults, whether it's lawful or unlawful in the country or in the state that the person is in. The other way that we may see it is that someone has no contact with drugs ever before, or never had a problem with drugs, and then they're essentially forced with the use of drugs or coerced with use of drugs to then have sex. So now something of value, whether they wanted it or not, is given to them, right? These drugs, and then they're essentially made uh, incapacitated or unable to then stop what's going to happen next, which will be often paid sex or sex without pay. So it doesn't matter whether the person came with a goal of having drugs and then got pulled into this coercive thing later, or if the person never planned on doing drugs or wasn't an addict and then ended up in this situation. Either way, we're most likely looking at commercial sex trafficking and a T visa.
So how about 245I scams? So 245I eligibility is this narrow category which would allow someone to file for adjustment of status, also known as green card or LPR, from within the United States, even if they're out of status now, but only if someone had filed a petition for them on or before April 30th, 2001. So it's significant for people who came across the border without papers, which is defined as entering without being inspected, admitted, or paroled, or if they're otherwise out of status, because that's not something that can be easily cured in other kinds of adjustment of status applications. So can you talk about how a 245I scam relates to T visas?
Sure. So we've seen people who more than 20 years ago started a case. Maybe a family member sponsored them or an employer sponsored them or said that they would. And why am I seeing this person 24 years after that started? Because they never did get their green card through the 245I program. That means something usually went sideways. Sometimes the employer never filed anything, but charged them thousands of dollars for a lawyer supposedly to file things. Sometimes fraudulent marriages were created, and then supposedly that was going to get them covered under 245I to get their green card, but that didn't obviously go so well. Marrying a U.S. citizen with the intention of evading the immigration system may have a lifetime bar for certain types of immigration applications, but that type of fraud can be waived in the T visa context. So when we're seeing somebody who was supposed to have fallen under this, uh, people call it like the amnesty law, but it's not really an amnesty, this 245I provision where someone was sponsored long ago and should now be able to continue their immigration process. When we're seeing them in 2024 or later, it's usually because the case didn't work out and there was some type of victimization that took place. And so now we're going to file for a T visa. And that again kind of comes back to the time limit issue. People think, oh, well, it happened 24 years ago. How could I possibly file for a T visa now? And I say, this is why we do what we do. We're going to talk about all the other things that have happened to you since the time those scams took place and document your victimization and the stress and fear that you went through. And folks, this is stuff that may have happened 24 years ago, but people are still suffering from what happened that long ago.
Absolutely. So we also like to screen closely to see if a T visa could be a more helpful or faster remedy than what somebody might already have applied for, or if they're in the process of applying for. So the things that you see here are SIJS, Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, DACA or DREAM remedies, or a U visa. So do you want to talk us through these? And then we can see what might be possible for someone who is also eligible for one of these things.
With special immigrant juvenile status, we usually have a wait time issue. So there may be a custody order that shows that the child either suffered abuse, abandonment, or neglect, or some other similar situation. Oftentimes, it's a single parent case where the custody order is now in place and they may be filing for an I-360 special immigrant juvenile petition, which hopefully will give that child an option to eventually obtain permanent residency. But some of the wait times on those cases might be 5 or 7 years or more just because of the quotas and immigration processing times. So if someone's under 18, we're going to be looking to see whether or not we may be able to make a shepherd referral, which provides that child under 18 with additional benefits, including public benefits, while they're in the process of seeking SIJ or a T visa or both. Sometimes we'll add on a T visa case as well. Or sometimes the child's already turned 18 years old. Their SIJ case may not have worked out, but we'll go back and revisit that for possibly some type of abuse or other situation that might qualify the child for a T visa. And combining SIJ and T visa cases is generally okay to do, but we do always want to closely collaborate and look back at previous filings because we are going to want to review for discrepancies or things that maybe weren't done right the first time to make sure if we need to do amendments, we've got the correct information going on the T visa application to the Immigration Service. With DACA, we get this a lot in consultations. So it's been a long time since Obama originally made the announcement for Dreamers to be able to apply for deferred action and work authorization. It's been over a decade and we still don't have a final stable immigration option for them. Some DACA holders have moved forward after having married U.S. citizens to apply for permanent residency if they've qualified that way. But many people just keep renewing their DACA every year, not realizing that they may have a T visa option. What I often hear is, can I apply for DACA and a T visa? Am I going to lose one of those? And usually the answer is, as long as we do things ethically and honestly, it shouldn't be an issue to apply for a T visa and just keep your DACA active or renewed until the T visa is finally approved. And then from there, move on to the permanent resident option. The other thing about DACA is that often people did come here when they were very young. They may not remember their entry to the United States. They might have been a baby when that happened. We'll usually do the consultation first to see if there was something that has happened since their entry that they do remember that might be trafficking to apply for a T visa. Additionally, in cases where we have positive and healthy relationships with the parents or other people who brought the child, we may be looking at whether or not the parents have been trafficked, and we may include parents and children or adult children in T visa filings. So sometimes we're just talking to one person who's a dreamer, and other times we're saying we need to look at your parents' situation too, with your permission, and if people will be willing to do it. And then we'll add on additional confidential consultations to try to come up with a strategy where the whole family can get their T visas and residencies, not just one person. So that can be a very attractive option, where a lot of times DACA holders think their parents will never have an option, or their parents think they'll never have an option and have only focused on their children. We go, hey, wait a minute, did anybody ever look at a T visa? I'll also often hear, well, but the lawyer only talked to me about DACA. And I'm thinking, often because that's all that they were offering at the time. But there have been changes since 2012, removal of certain time limits. Then there was a regulation that came out in 2016. There was another uh, policy manual that came out in 2021. There have been two regulatory changes in 2024, all that expanded and improved T visa options. And so if someone had a consultation in 2012 with me, there's no way I would have offered them options for a T visa based on the law as it would exist in 2024, right? I would have done a T visa in certain cases in 2012, but the expanded options now make it so that many people are eligible. So if you're watching this video and you have DACA, please ask for a consultation to be fully screened to see if you can switch over to a T visa while we're still waiting on immigration reform.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about U visa applicants? I feel like this one comes across our desks all
We
the time.
Yeah, that's right. We mentioned this in part one of the video that U visas are, of course, these humanitarian visas for victims of certain qualified crimes, but they are taking an incredibly long time for that applicant to get that final U visa in hand. And even me, when I was in law school and I worked in an immigration clinic and I had a U visa filed in first semester, and in second semester, that person had their approval in hand. And now in 2024, I won't tell you how long of a time span that is, but it is just taking an unreasonably long time. So even after someone gets a bona fide determination and can get a work permit after that partial review, it's still taking a long time. So what do we do, Helen, if someone has a U visa already filed?
So usually if we're having a situation like that, my first question is going to be, let's do a consultation and let's see, can we continue with the U visa option, or are there major amendments that need to be made? There are really short deadlines in some cases to file for a U visa. And so sometimes the application paperwork just got rushed to immigration. So we may have to amend it or update it for things that have changed since the time the case was filed, or things that weren't quite put correctly on the first time. So that's one thing we're looking at. Another thing I'll look at and see is, did we get a bona fide determination yet? Or is this U visa just pending this person's no work authorization whatsoever? We may be looking at filing a lawsuit called a mandamus to expedite that work authorization, or without a lawsuit, trying something like a medical expedite to expedite the work authorization. That's a stabilization goal. So first thing we're looking at, is there any correction needed to be made? Second thing I'm looking at is there a way I can speed up work authorization to help stabilize our client's life? And then the third thing we're looking at, often in the same consultation, is there a T visa we can add on? Because let's say you might be waiting 10 or 15 years for residency through a U visa process based on whenever your case was filed. Well, with T visas, you might cut that time down to a couple of years before getting T visa status, and a few more years before getting permanent residency. So some people are saving more than 10 years in their estimated wait time to get permanent residency. And that also matters related to travel authorization and family reunification goals and things like that. It is usually okay to have a U and T visa case filed, but again, it's an issue for a consultation, because sometimes one case will close out the other. So if a U visa is filed and pending, and then the T visa is approved, it's fine to close the U because you kind of don't need it anyway. But what if we had derivative beneficiaries? Maybe there's someone there who wouldn't fit under the T visa framework. Or sometimes I'll be adding on a T visa because it actually will add in parents and brothers of an adult, which the U visa couldn't have covered at some point in time. So there's some specific things about derivative beneficiaries we're also looking at in consultations. So that's why our consultations take a really long time, and our pre-screening process might be several hours as well, because we're gathering all this information to make comprehensive legal decisions and give proper advice during the consultation.
Thank you so much, Helen, for the Part 2 T visa overview. So we'll just conclude with encouraging anyone who's listening to this to remember that trafficking can take many forms. A qualified attorney will want to hear the whole story of your life. There are many different kinds of trafficking, and what we went over today were just a few examples, and that trafficking victimization can overlap. Sex trafficking and labor trafficking can happen anywhere. They can happen to the same person. More than one thing can happen to the same person. So if someone has any questions and wants to know about their options, they should book a consultation with an attorney to learn more about what's possible for their family. So thank you so much, Helen, for your time today.
Thank you, Taba. There's no way I could have done this without you. I so appreciate the time and work and effort it took to put this slide deck and presentation together. And I hope for anybody who's watching this that it really does help them understand better how T visas can work. And if this doesn't apply to you, maybe it'll apply to someone else who needs this help.
Absolutely. Thank you. Goodbye.